And just like that, the media pivoted and changed from unremitting coverage of COVID to ceaseless, unrelenting news cycles dedicated to Ukraine. Of course, as a good citizen, you'll have the good taste not to notice the change in coverage. So far as you're concerned, it's all a figment of your imagination. Speaking of the Politburo's new policy, Mark Zuckerberg changed the hate speech rules for his metaverse to allow calls for violence against Putin. Even the UN condemned the platform for allowing this to happen. But to spare you the boredom related to the new chosen outrage of the day, I wanted to talk less about Zuckerberg's double standards related to Eastern Europe than about another story related to him. The New American has an article entitled, "Wisconsin's Special Counsel Finds Facebook's Zuckerberg Violated Wisconsin Election Bribery Laws." What interested me more than the specific facts on this particular case was the more general trend, namely the corporatization of American politics. At least that's what Raheem Kassam calls it.
Natalie, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not sure that anybody was asking him to overturn an election, right? That he was going to bang the gavel and say, you know what, I think Trump should have another 4 years. That isn't what the point was. The point was to look seriously at the unlawful nature of what you described, Natalie, a lot of the changes that were made in election law, a lot of these drop boxes. You call it privatization. I call it corporatization of the U.S. election system.
This is not, in fact, a new phenomenon. In a previous video, we went over how, according to the Constitution, the Electoral College was supposed to pick our presidents. This was supposed to be a group of wise and ethical men chosen by the state legislatures to convene in one place. Candidates before 1824 would go to the Electoral College and vie for the backing of these electors. By this method, the states had massive influence over the federal layer of government, because it was these delegates from the states who chose them. After 1824, however, political parties started having caucuses, and they began choosing candidates months before the Electoral College. These political parties are not in our Constitution. They're private corporations, essentially shell companies for wealthy oligarchs, and by them usurping authority from the Electoral College, they essentially stole checks and balances from the states over the federal layer of government and assumed that role themselves. So without a shot being fired, the business sector claimed that it was now taking over the constitutional responsibilities of the government. We saw this earlier in 1791 when Alexander Hamilton lobbied to get the First National Bank crammed in, despite no constitutional authority to create a central bank for the nation. This private bank usurped the powers of Congress to regulate the nation's money and essentially took over the functions of the Treasury. 80% of the bank's stock was held by foreign financiers, so we had foreigners controlling our country, acting as a branch of government when they weren't. Of course, the good people of America had the sense to dissolve the First National Bank in 1811, but 100 years later in 1913, America got another version of it in the Federal Reserve. But now even the Federal Reserve's functions are being taken over by giant global mega-conglomerate BlackRock. See Catherine Austin Fitts talk about it here.
In my world as a financial person, I cannot tell you how shocking it was. They basically turned over operational asset management functions for the Fed and the New York Fed to BlackRock. They just simply delegated. Mm-hmm. This is the equivalent of, imagine if the Department of Justice called you up and said, Whitney, we want you to start a company and we're going to turn over different aspects of enforcement for the United States to your company.
When Fitts poses the hypothetical of a private corporation taking over the functions of the Department of Justice, she's not being facetious. We see this happening all the time, such as in the case of for-profit prisons. Judges were being bribed to give people harsher sentences to fill these prisons, and they'd get kickbacks for every person incarcerated. In 2008, for instance, judges Michael Conahan and Mark Ciavarella were convicted of accepting money in return for imposing harsh adjudications on juveniles to increase occupancy at the Pennsylvania Child Care for-Profit detention centers. States and municipalities love these arrangements. They call them public-private partnerships. But the difference between an older public-private partnership and what's happening now is twofold. For instance, in the olden days, when a city put a contract out for bid to get a company to take care of its garbage collection, those contracts had oversight, and the terms of these contracts were limited. They might be enforced for a year and then expire, after which someone else was chosen. Today, corporations are taking over functions of government with no oversight and open-ended terms for their operations. Like when the Fed took over the Treasury. When this happened back in 1791, the bank was only chartered for 20 years. After that, it had to be revoted on by Congress. With the Federal Reserve in 1913, there was no such 20-year charter. It was open-ended and, as it turned out, permanent. So this goes beyond a public-private partnership. This amounts to a coup d'etat from corporations. What Americans have to understand is that there are dangers involved in allowing companies to unlawfully assume the functions of government. What states and municipalities are marketing to you as harmless public-private partnerships have another name: Back in the 1920s, Italian fascist tactician Giovanni Gentile said, "Fascism should more properly be called corporatism, because it is the merger of state and corporate power." We see this now as big tech companies are taking on the role of intelligence agencies and spying on the public, or when GoFundMe shuts off people's money if they have the wrong political views. What we're watching now is the rollout and normalization of fascism across the West, and whether fascism goes by a swastika or a rainbow flag, it boils down to the same thing: the loss of a people's freedom and self-determination and the rise of a new criminal class operating outside of the law. John Locke defined tyranny as the projection of power without legal authority. Question: who gave the Coca Cola Corporation legal authority over you? How about Apple? How about BlackRock? How about any pharmaceutical company? Did the social contract embodied by the Constitution grant any corporation the powers that they now seem to be exercising without oversight and without sunset limitations? Let's repeat that. Tyranny is the projection of power without legal authority. By that definition, are we living under tyranny? Consider Zbigniew Brzezinski's creation of the SES, the Senior Executive Service, in 1979 under Jimmy Carter. This was a program by which corporate America was invited to send over representatives to operate inside our civil service. Brzezinski placed these unelected business leaders at the top of every department of government. So if you're in the Department of Agriculture, for instance, placed in a position over the head of that organization is a senior executive serviceman. He's the boss's boss. He's the unconstitutional, unelected bottleneck through which all decisions are made. Well, at least since 1979. This is the reason why Eisenhower in the 1950s could defend the borders. There was no SES to stop him. It's why when Trump tried to do the same thing in 2016, he was sabotaged. Instead of consulting the Constitution to see what powers he had, he was told to consult the Senior Executive Service. And guess what? They told him that he didn't have the powers that the Constitution said he did. Corporate America wanted cheap labor after all, and so their answer to the president was predictably self-serving. Disastrously, Trump didn't go to the rule book, the Constitution. He went to the saboteurs and asked permission from men who aren't even in the chain of command. Well, I guess the president isn't in the chain of command anymore, and that's a problem. We have corporate leaders with higher security clearances than the commander-in-chief. When that happens, you're no longer in a republic, and rule of law is no longer in force. You're living in a time period where corporations project power without legal authority, an age where there is a merger between state and corporate power. There's a name for that. I wonder what it is. Our freedoms are under attack, yet the loss of freedom is not inevitable. America can be saved, and an informed citizenry can and will make the difference. Join us weekly for episodes of Beyond the Cover, and check out our print magazine too at thenewamerican.com.